International trade. So today I'll introduce you to the topic of absolute and comparative advantage. We'll talk about what happens when a country has an absolute advantage in all goods. We'll talk about intra-industry trade between similar economies and the benefits of reducing barriers to international trade. While the iPhone is readily recognized as an Apple product, many versions, including recently released offerings, have key components made by rival phone maker Samsung. In international trade, there are often conflicts like this as each country or company focuses on what it does best. So, international trade has been a part of our country since its founding, and it's an important aspect of commerce throughout the world. And so, a lot of our biggest trading partners are Mexico and Canada. The reason we trade is because of absolute and comparative advantage. The evidence that international trade confers overall benefits on economies is pretty strong. So, what is absolute advantage? It's when one country can use fewer resources to produce a good compared to another country, or when a country is more productive compared to another country. That's absolute advantage. What's comparative advantage? That's when a country can produce a good at a lower cost in terms of other goods. This is an example of why comparative and absolute advantage works. So, if Saudi Arabia can produce 100 barrels of oil at maximum and zero corn, or 25 bushels of corn and zero oil, point B, it can also produce other combinations of oil and corn if it wants to consume both goods, such as point C. All points above the frontier are impossible to produce given the current level of resources and technology. We would learn that in our production possibilities frontier. If the United States produced oil, it can produce a maximum of 50 barrels, so half the barrels of oil as the Saudis, and zero corn. Or at the other extreme, it can produce a maximum of 100 bushels of corn and no oil. Other combinations of both oil and corn are possible, such as point C. The reason for this is just illustrating the use of trade. Since the Saudi Arabia can produce oil more abundantly and efficiently, and the U.S. can produce corn more abundantly and efficiently, because of comparative advantage, we should trade. We should trade corn for oil. And that's what this says. Since Saudi Arabia gives up the least in terms of corn to produce a barrel of oil, it has a comparative advantage in oil production. The United States gives up least in terms of oil to produce a bushel of corn. So it has a comparative advantage in corn. And so what you normally see is the country with a comparative advantage, they focus on one thing and they trade. Mexico has a comparative advantage in the production of avocados. So there's not many avocados produced here in the United States. Most are going to be produced in Mexico and traded with us for other goods and services. That is essence of trade and the essence of comparative advantage, absolute advantage. This graph here just shows the gains from trade A country that can consume more than it can produce as a result of specialization in trade. So in this graph, going back to the Saudi Arabia, if 20 units of oil is exported to the United States and exchanged for 20 units of corn, the Saudi domestic oil consumption is reduced by 20. This enables Saudi to reach point D, where oil consumption is now 40 barrels and corn consumption has increased to 30. Since the post-trade consumption point D is beyond its production possibilities frontier, Saudi Arabia gains from trade. Can one country have an absolute advantage in everything? This is typical for high-income countries that often have well-educated workers, technologically advanced equipment, and the most up-to-date production processes. These high-income countries can produce all products with fewer resources than a low-income country. However, even when one country has an absolute advantage in all products, trade can still benefit both countries. And that's what I want the key takeaway to be, that yes, I may have an advantage in everything, an absolute advantage, but allowing me to focus on the things I do the most, and then trade benefits everybody. This is because gains from trade comes from specialization in one's comparative advantage. Here is another example that you'll look through, but I wanted to just hit the point of what is comparative advantage, absolute advantage, why is it important? Even when one country has an absolute advantage in all goods and another country has an absolute disadvantage in all goods, both countries can still benefit from trade. Trade allows each country to take advantage of lower opportunity costs in the country. So the gain from international trade on both sides result from pursuing comparative advantage and producing at a lower opportunity cost. A simple example to better understand comparative advantage is, say, a group of friends who decide to go camping together. The six friends have a wide range of skill and experiences, but one person in the group has done lots of camping before and is also a great athlete. She has an absolute advantage in all aspects of camping, but should she do all the work? Absolutely not. If everyone sits around and waits for her to do everything, not only will she be an unhappy camper, but there will not be much output for her group of friends to consume. Everyone will benefit if they figure out their areas of comparative advantage, the area of camping where their productivity disadvantage is the least. If the campers coordinate their efforts according to comparative advantage, they can all gain. What a great example there. So, in short, the theory of comparative advantage suggests that trade should happen between economies with large differences in opportunity cost of production. But roughly half of all world trade involves shipping goods between the fairly similar high income economies: US, Canada, the EU, Japan, Mexico, and China. A high proportion of trade is intra-industry trade, international trade of goods within the same industry. Why? Because the division of labor leads to learning, innovation, unique skills, and most of all, it leads to scale, economies of scale, being able to produce massive amounts at the lowest unit cost. In working on very specific and particular products, firms in certain countries develop unique and different skills. Specialization in the world economy can be very finely split, splitting up the value chain. Many of the different stages of producing a good happens in different geographic locations. And then the term value chain. The value chain is just how a good is produced in stages. Economies of scale, the concept of economies of scale becomes especially relevant to international trade because it enables one or two producers to supply an entire country. International trade itself provides a way to combine the lower average production costs that come from economies of scale and still have competition and still have variety for consumers. This is an example of economies of scale. What I want you for this course is to just understand the term economies of scale. And this good example drives home that term. Tariffs. So, what are tariffs? I think we've heard that term quite a bit for the incoming administration. The term tariffs are a tax. It's a tax that government places on imported goods. Traditionally, tariffs were used simply as a political tool to protect certain vested economic, social, and cultural interests. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO, is a world organization that was constructed and committed to lowering barriers to trade. The world's nations, they meet through the WTO and they negotiate how they can reduce barriers to trade, such as tariffs. And that enhances the international trade spectrum and allows us to, I mean, you lower those barriers that gives countries the opportunity to help and grow their economies, specialize their economies, and hopefully create some economies of scale in producing some goods and services. Low income countries benefit from trade uh, more than high income countries. But before dismissing the gains from trade, it is worth remembering even a small gain is enough money to deserve attention, since this increase is not a one time event. It persists well into the future. Estimates of gains may be on the low side because some of the gains from trade are not measured well. It is difficult to measure the advantages to consumers of having a variety of products available and a greater degree of competition among producers, which we have in the US. It's hard to quantify it, but to us, it's a good thing because prices are always competitive. There's a lot of variety. Trade between countries often involved a transfer of knowledge that can involve skills in production, technology, management, finance, law. And so that another critical aspect is when you trade with countries that are less developed than you are, you also trade not only goods and services, but processes, the type of technologies that you use to help them advance, management styles, how we finance goods and services, and more importantly, the rule of law. And thank you very much for listening to International Trade.